You're tuned to 1520 WCAT Radio, and it's time now for the Avid Reader Show with your host, Sam Hankin. Sam will offer reviews and interviews of some of the more interesting books and authors of today. And now, Sam Hankin.
Afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Avid Reader. Today, we are really lucky enough to have with us Michael Smerconish, whose new book, he's written several of them, Talk, is being released tomorrow. So we're lucky enough to, you guys are going to hear this before the book is actually out. So Michael, as many of you know, since he's a local boy, he's the host of the Michael Smerconish program on Sirius XM Channel 124, and is also, as of March, the host of his own show on Saturday mornings on CNN. He was the first radio host to interview President Barack Obama live from the White House. Actually, I think he's interviewed him like 7 times. He's authored 5 books, 2 of which were bestsellers for the New York Times, including Flying Blind. He's also written Muzzled, Murdered by a Mumia, Morning Drive, and Instinct. He writes a column, as many of you probably read, in the Sunday edition of the Philadelphia Inquirer, has been an on-air contributor with MSNBC, and has guest hosted Hardball with Chris Matthews. He's also been a guest on The Today Show, The Colbert Report, The O'Reilly Factor, Larry King Live, The View, and Real Time with Bill Maher. He's practiced law for 10 years and is a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania Law School and Lehigh. Lives here in Philadelphia with his wife and 4 children. And Michael, with that introduction, how the hell do you have time to write a book?
Stan, it took me a lot longer than I thought that it would take, and it was much, much more difficult than any of the nonfiction that you referenced that I wrote before this. It's a project that spans 4 years, and I know it because I'm able to look at pictures of family vacations and think back, oh, okay, I remember that summer, here's what I was writing in this book. And it's something I'm very proud of. I love the finished product, but finding time was very difficult.
Gosh, it gives me some insight, because if it took 4 years, then you were writing right in the middle of, as you say during the book, quote, the most important election of our lifetime. So you were writing right in the middle of that.
Listen, truth be told, I had hoped that this book would be a book that could come out for the 2012 cycle. And it just wasn't ready, and it caused me to have to change a number of things in the whole arc that I was working on. And I worried while I was writing it that it would become less timely because I didn't meet the timetable I had in mind. Frankly, it's become even more relevant today, sadly for bad reasons vis-a-vis the country. But I think it'll be even more timely going toward the midterm election.
Yeah, it's funny because I was going to say the book is set in the near future, which it's almost really not. It's set now. It's just that you substitute characters for characters.
Well, I didn't want to really have the book get diverted on President Obama. And so I tried to deal with President Obama as a real presidency that had occurred. Mm-hmm. I'm a little bit mysterious in terms of how far post-Obama we are, because, he's so polarizing, and I thought that if I dealt too much with him in the book, it would be a diversion from the real messages that I wanted to offer.
Yeah, but you do deal with, not stereotypes, but doppelgangers for other characters. Like, you have a character in your book who's very like Sarah Palin.
You think so?
Well, since you kind of say so. Yeah. Well, that brings me to the next question, I guess, is because Stan, and here I am, and I feel bad because I'm like Stan in the beginning, broadcasting from a 5,000-watt station. So it's like, oh, man, look where he is and look where I am.
Well, listen, if you get an advisor like Phil Dean and you want to do paint-by-numbers talk radio, you can just follow that lead and ride it.
Well, that's interesting about the book, too, because, instead of me blabbing, why don't you tell our listeners, because it's coming out tomorrow, tell us a little bit about the book first. Then we'll
okay, and I guess I better get used to doing this. So as you point out, the book is a work of fiction set in the not-too-distant future, and the protagonist is a guy named Stan Powers. Stan is a former stoner and slacker, born and raised in Fort Myers, Florida, who becomes a classic rock DJ and a successful classic rock DJ after, frankly, he finds that he has a skill set in identifying drinking songs. I don't want to say too much more about it, but that's the way that he gets into the industry. And then after he's had success and rises to the level of doing afternoon drive at a station in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, he's offered the opportunity to return to his home state go back to Florida and do talk radio in the Tampa, Orlando, St. Petersburg area. But there's a station switch, a flag switch, as we put it in the business, where the station goes from classic rock to talk before he can begin his first shift. And he's offered the opportunity to try his hand as a talk radio host, but he knows nothing about it. He frankly doesn't even have a political guidepost of his own. If pushed, he probably would say that he's liberal, particularly on social issues. But he decides, what the hell, I'm going to give it a shot because the station has promised me that I will be able to rely on the guidance of the guru to the talk industry, a somewhat mysterious figure named Phil Dean, who himself is a burned-out DJ and found his calling as someone who programs for talk radio hosts what they should discuss and what they should say. And so he embarks on this path where he's saying all sorts of things with which he personally disagrees, but the crazier the stuff that comes out of his mouth, at least from his standpoint, the higher his star rises. And all of this happens as the Republicans are coming to his hometown because it's such a critical area in the political landscape. And so he's a kingmaker. The former stoner and slacker who says things with which he personally disagrees is in a position where he can influence, yes, as you put it, the most important presidential race of our lifetime.
Well, it's really interesting because you and I share so much. I mean, I lived in Gainesville, went to the University of Florida, been practicing law in medical negligence, products liability for the past 30-some years. I used to hang out at Burn's Steakhouse, and I loved it. I loved it when you described it, the same exact thought when I walked in, a New Orleans bordello. And it's like I looked at that and I said, holy mackerel, he must have heard me say that or something.
Well, I don't know if you're allowed to say, for avid reader, the rest of my description of Burns.
No.
But that was a scene I loved writing, and it was a scene that I could only write having sat there and had the experience. I mean, the steak experience, not the other experience that I described.
Right. It's old like the dessert room with its own radio station.
Exactly.
Yeah, and they used to bring you martinis, and they would have an eyedropper, and they would ask you how many drops of vermouth you wanted in your martini. It was a cool place. Well, so, yeah, that brings me to another point. I mean, obviously there's a portion of this that's autobiographical to a certain extent, and I won't give away stuff, but there's a time when Stan talks in a way that sounds very much like your journey in real life, from your political attitudes in the past to your much more tempered attitude in today's broadcasting.
There's no doubt that I have drawn on elements that I've lived and that I have experienced. It's really not autobiographical because I never, even, right or wrong, I never said things with which I personally disagreed. So I never experienced the kind of a conflict that Stan Powers goes through in talk. But I certainly, Sam, you know how it is. They say everybody's got one novel in them, right? And so I wanted to draw on that which I knew best. I first sized up the landscape, and I was surprised that no one had really done it, especially in the modern era. Eric Bogosian did talk and did it on Broadway, and it was a movie. But this is some ground that needs to be explored, and the way that I did it was to take you inside that world and the syndication world. I'm sure others will say differently, but it's not my story.
Well, when did you, and Stan in a moment of epiphany, when did you decide that civil discourse is something that we should all devoutly hope for?
In a post-9/11 world, I was initially on September 11, and for a few years thereafter, I was buying into the Bush approach to the war on terror, which became pretty much the seminal event of my life beyond personal milestones. And over a period of time, I came to conclude that the way in which we were fighting that war was hard but not smart. I broke from the Republican Party after 30 years because I thought that Obama on foreign policy made more sense than Bush and then McCain did. And it was in the process of reevaluating the way in which I was looking at the world politically that I kind of stepped back and took stock of what the dialogue had become. And so I would say that it was somewhere in that 2008, 2009, especially during the Obama election in 2008, the way in which he was treated immediately after the election without ever having been given a fair shake, at least according to me, to approach the job, that I stepped back and I said, what has this process become? It is so polarized. Where is it coming from? I am strongly of the view, as I expressed in the book, that too many individuals who are in an elected capacity are taking too many cues from individuals with microphones who, frankly, are without portfolio. Nobody ever elected them. And I think they've led us down a dangerous path. I'm someone with opinions. I am of decided opinions. I think they defy any kind of a label. That's sort of the outlier in my industry. I think that's kind of sad that you need to adhere to a litmus test in order to get on the air today, because that's not the way that it was when I began 30 years ago. And so I wanted to write on this. The natural thing for me to do would probably have been to write a nonfiction book post-2008, maybe even post-2012, or combine the elections and say, where the hell are we right now? But I wanted to take liberties. I wanted to make it entertaining. And I frankly, and time is going to tell, because as you say, the book comes out tomorrow. But I thought maybe I can have more of an impact if I write this as a book of fiction than I could if I approached it as a nonfiction project. And so that's what I set out to do. And pardon my long-windedness, I'll just say one other thing. I mistakenly believed that this would be an easier book to write if I wrote it as fiction, and I was completely wrong in that regard.
Yeah, it's really interesting because there are times in the book where, I think it took a lot of courage on your part, where you're kind of finding certain, weak spots in people and almost pressing your finger into that weak spot, and you really had to go out on a limb. And the corollary of that is now when I listen to your show, like even when you talk to that guy who wrote about the Central Park condominium, or when you talk to the poor couple whose daughter had died because of the GM ignition switch controversy.
Oof,
what I know, and you brought that up, you brought that up and said that was your moment of the week or whatever. And the thing I notice about you now is that you maybe only asked like 3 or 4 questions, and so what should happen is you let the people tell the story. Just like if you're a doctor and you listen to your patient, or if you're a lawyer and you listen to your client, you get so much more out of it if you're not ego-driven,
Hey, I'm ego-driven.
So
I can't imagine I would do what I do for a living if I didn't have a significant ego, but I don't think mine compares to those with whom I compete. The whole industry is so different from the industry in which I cut my teeth. When I first got on the air, it was a pre-Rush world. It was a late 80s, early 90s. Limbaugh was syndicated in 91, 92. And the only thing that mattered in terms of whether you would be on a talk radio station in America is whether you could conduct a good conversation. No one was going to stop you at the door and ask for your conservative bona fides. When I think about the station where I initially worked, I guest hosted for a guy named Bernie Herman. Bernie was the 10 p.m. to 1 a.m. person, and his moniker is that he was the gentleman of broadcasting. And I often think about Bernie, and I give him a little tip of the hat in the book.
Yeah, you do.
Because I think if Bernie were knocking on the door of a program director today, and they said, well, what's your shtick? And he said, well, I'm the gentleman of broadcasting, he'd never get on the air. Because today it's all towing that line. And at some point, it's just ridiculous. A broken clock is right twice a day. And I don't know who could listen to only that myopic view of the world. That's what I wanted to express, because it's a form of entertainment that people are now mistaking for news, and they're making important decisions based on it, and it needs to be exposed.
And my hero, like yours, is Adlai Stevenson, because even though he lost twice to Eisenhower, he was just a guy who sat down and told you the truth and what he thought.
Right.
And he couldn't, based on that, he couldn't possibly win. And that's when I realized, even though I was a little kid, I realized, wait a minute, this guy told the truth. The other guy really isn't saying anything, and this guy lost. Doesn't make any sense to me.
Well, and I tried to deal with that in the book because, the candidate that the protagonist, Sam Powers, really likes is Wynne James.
Right.
And he never believes at the outset that Wynne has a shot, that he's going to get gobbled up in the Republican primary process. And frankly, in the end, he's the one who takes him out,
I know.
which is a large part of the conflict.
Well, that's the other thing about Stan, and I guess what makes a good novel, too, for the reader. I mean, you're asking the reader to do some work in this book, and which is good. I mean, I that's why I have a bookstore. I mean, I like books where the reader is forced to work himself. And in your book, what is the reader supposed to think of Stan? What kind of person is he? Is he good? Is he bad? Is he a combination of both? Is he two people?
I don't think he's entirely good or entirely bad.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to sell you in the course of the book on the idea that he's a real noble individual. Stan Powers is self-centered, and that's the way he runs much of his professional life. Although, I think, without giving it away, there's redemption in this book for him.
Yes, there is. And he also has a kind of muse in the book who tries to steer him the right way, too. But a lot of what Stan does is he just doesn't, again, I'm not going to use the avid reader word, but he just doesn't give about what he thinks. He just is kind of moving along and goes with the flow and doesn't really have a moral compass for a good portion of the time anyway. So since you mentioned Rush, and you don't have to answer any of these if you don't want to, but if you go through the litany, because, that's who people listen to. I mean, you've got Glenn Beck, you've got Joe Scarborough, you have Bill O'Reilly, you have Sean Hannity, you have Dennis Miller, for God's sakes, and then you have Chris Matthews. I mean, how do you rank these people? Who do you respect? Who do you not respect? You obviously respect Chris Matthews, as do I. But he's had a change, too.
The book, as you know, revolves around a talk radio character, and talk radio, for reasons I explain in the book, is dominated by conservatives. But I did go out of my way in the book to say that the same problem exists on the left. On one hand, there are people who are cocooned in this country in a Fox talk radio drudge mindset, and there are others who are completely devoted to HuffPo and to MSNBC. And my advocacy is to say, well, that's fine. Just change the dial every once in a while and make sure you're being entertaining of all viewpoints. The right will come off worse in this book because that's what Stan is surrounded by, and that's what Stan was playing as a role, frankly. But I'm not letting the left off the hook either. And hopefully you glean that from the book. I mean, I guess Stan could have been working at a left-of-center cable station, but I would have had a harder time tackling that.
Yeah, I can understand that. And I can say this stuff following without giving away the book, because I've seen you say it on the air, where your opinions fall into that area of civil discourse, into that middle area that Stan is kind of, falls into in a good way towards the end of the book, which is like you believe in the right to have guns, but you don't believe in the right to have an assault weapon, kind of. You don't believe the war in Iraq was a good idea. You believe if a guy kills a cop, like in your book, one of your books you wrote about, then he should be killed. You believe in a lot of middle ground positions that both the left and the right would be essentially crucifying you for. But and in abortion, you didn't mention abortion in your last broadcast, but I think in abortion, because you do touch on this in the book, that in situations of rape or incest, I think you would say that abortion is acceptable in your mind, correct?
My mind or Stan's mind, or both?
Both.
I think we would see it the same way. So, yes, in the way you've phrased it.
Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of the problem in the world today is because whether you're pro-life or pro-choice, you're not going to listen for 1 second to the other person's side.
No, but Sam, here's something to keep in mind.
What?
Gallup took a look at the country in this past January in the same way that Esquire last November. I hope I'm getting my years straight. I am. Gallup in January, Esquire last November. In fact, Esquire brought together the Romney and the Obama pollsters, and they did a joint survey because each wanted to find what's the size of the center in this country. And Gallup in January, and this was similar to the result from Esquire, said 42% of the country don't want to regard themselves as R's or D's, they are I's. if you turned on a radio station anywhere across the country and it were talk radio, or you looked at the cable news world, you'd never know those people exist, and yet they are the largest block. Somehow, and this is the core argument of talk. We who are independent thinking have completely ceded the ground for discourse to the far left and the far right, and it's time to take it back. Otherwise, we've got individuals like this guy, Stan Powers, picking presidents, and that's not healthy for the country.
Well, other than you at 9 o'clock in the morning on CNN on Saturdays, trying to be kind and civil to everybody, how would you propose going about affecting that change?
Well, the first thing people need to do is recognize that their entertainment choices, because that's what these really are, have consequences. And you know, when I speak, whether it's on my own program or if I'm invited by groups and I speak in different locations, this is always what I try to do is bring awareness. I'm hopeful. If you were to say to me, what do you want people to take away from the book? I would say, I hope a lot of laughs. I sure hope that they're entertained. If they're not entertained, then I've failed in my mission, and I may as well have just written it nonfiction. But I hope when they close that cover, they say to themselves, Jesus, this thing has really gotten out of hand, and maybe I need to reevaluate where I'm going for my news and my entertainment.
Well, yeah, and it's funny because the book really is entertaining. You take the politics out of it completely. The book really is entertaining, and it's funny, especially when it touches nerves with me, like when you're talking about rock and roll. And you obviously like rock and roll. I mean, I saw Pink Floyd at the Electric Factory in 1969. I went to Woodstock, and you actually in your book talk about the stub of a ticket from Woodstock, and
right.
I threw my tickets away because the fences had already been torn down, and I wish I had kept those tickets.
I'll bet.
But
somebody, and you're referring to Stan being sent or handed a ticket stub. That happened. You
really?
Want to know which part is true and which part isn't true. I can't explain it, but somebody once gave me a Woodstock ticket stubs, or so they said they were original. Who knows? But yeah, a lot of those anecdotes in it that you might scratch your head and say, did that really happen? Oftentimes they did.
Yeah, you can almost get a feel for it, like a visceral sixth sense feel for what you're saying that really happened to you. It's funny too because one of the things you ask, you talk about essentially how the people who call in aren't the important people. And then you say, your mentor says, hey Stan, did you ever call into a radio show? And he goes, no. And he goes, well, there you go. So have you called into one?
I did years ago. I absolutely did as a teenager. I think I was a prank caller when I called. This was before Baba Booey to y'all, but that kind of a thing. But that statement was said to me by a consultant, a consultant who said to me, when was the last time you called a radio station? And I said, well, I haven't, at least not as an adult. And he said, as is reported in the book, well, exactly. In fact, I think the line was then, these callers are there for you to use as your props.
Yeah. Tell the listeners about the 3 things you can say when the board isn't lit up with people calling in. That was great.
Well, one of the things this is another. I don't want to give away too much from it, but
you don't have to if you don't want to.
I'll give you one line, and in fact, I'm going to tell you where it came from because local people might be able to put this together. This is something that Sid Mark told me. The great Sid Mark, who for 50-some years has been hosting a Sinatra program, that he says was told to him by Frank Ford. Frank Ford was a talk radio host of many, many years, and he was a doctrinaire liberal, married to Lynn Abraham. I mean, Frank Ford today could never get on the air, and yet Frank Ford had a wonderful career for many, many years as a talk radio host. So this is me telling you what Sid told me and what Frank told Sid, which was, if you're ever sitting there and there's a dark board and you need to make those phones ring, there are 3 things you can do that will instantly light the lines. One of them is just say to people, don't tell me where I can walk my dog. So Stan Powers, the stoner and slacker who knows classic rock but doesn't know talk radio, he thinks initially that all he needs to do is make the phone ring. And if those phones are ringing, he must be successful. And he relies on that. One morning when he's starting his show and the show isn't going well because nobody's calling, he begins a dog story, totally concocted. He doesn't have a dog. he references a schnauzer, and he isn't even sure what a schnauzer looks like. Has to Google schnauzer during the commercial break, and gets into a tiff or so, he says, with a woman on the beach. And
an old lady.
An old lady, right, right. In fact, I think, well, I don't want to say the line, but yes. And but this is some people's perception of talk radio, that calls make you successful. They don't, because if calls made you successful, I could go on any radio station in the country and I could say the word abortion, or I could say the word guns, and every line would light. But the only people who'd really be interested in that would be the 10 or so people who'd be calling, and they'd be calling anytime you mentioned guns or abortion. So.
Yeah,
you've clearly read it, and for that I'm grateful. I hope you liked it.
I loved it, and first of all, I would never consider interviewing an author without reading the book. It seems discourteous to me, and secondly, I have this independent bookstore, and starting tomorrow, your book's going to be sitting out there,
Good.
And hopefully, since you're around here, I'm just in Downingtown, just past. I'm right across the street from the Downingtown interchange of the Turnpike. And maybe you can come out, or maybe you can Skype in, because I want to try and get it to be a book club book, because I think it would obviously be a great book club book.
That would be great.
And then maybe
I'd be thrilled to be supportive.
Okay. Well, with that, I could ask other questions, but I think that's a pretty good resume preface of the book, and I highly recommend it. I read it in one sitting, which kind of
that's great.
Yeah, well, it got me upset because I didn't get to bed till 3 o'clock in the morning, and I had to get my kids to the bus at 6. So you really screwed up my night.
Can I say this? And you've heard this from people before. No doubt, you read an advanced reader copy.
Yes.
And in addition to going back and fixing misspelled words and correcting grammar and so forth, I also added, I don't know, somewhere between 5 and 10 pages of content relative to the campaign. Because as I read it, I thought I come up a little bit short here in having fully explained what goes on in the campaign that serves as a backdrop. And so grab a hardback copy, and I think you'll learn a few things that you didn't in the advanced reader copy.
I'll do so. I'll do it as soon as I get them in. As soon as 12:01 a.m. Okay.
Good.
Well, thanks so much. It's a pleasure talking to you.
Come on. Thank you. I'm appreciative of the interest.
Well, I look forward to, like I said, having the book there, having you come out if you can, and best of luck. Not best of luck. You're doing great. You're doing great on everything, and I really appreciate you.
Thanks for saying that.
Okay. You're welcome.
See you, Sam.
See ya. That was Michael Smerconish. That was a great talk. He's a local guy. Everybody knows him. His book is called Talk. It's a novel about... Like I said, it's almost in the present, basically, about a presidential election that's going to be close. And it's kind of like Primary Colors, but it's much closer to home because it deals with things that are kind of happening now. And if you watch him now on CNN or listen to his show on Sirius XM, you'll see that he's become, he was always intelligent and nice, but he's become much more moderate, and he listens. And he tries to establish this idea that civil discourse between two people, whether they're moderators or a moderator and a guest, can really change the way our government works, the way our politics works, the way our day-to-day lives work. Just take the moment to listen to somebody and take a moment to speak to them politely, cogently, in a civilized way. So that was a great talk. I'm so glad that he was able to join us today. Next week, we will welcome a writer whose work has been compared to Chekhov and Carver. His name is David James Poussin, and he's going to discuss his debut collection of short stories, The Heaven of Animals. And we're getting a lot of short story books in, which I love. For some reason, people don't seem to love them as much as I do. They like novels. But I would strongly recommend, there's so many good short story books out now that you... take a look at this one, The Heaven of Animals by David James Poussin. In any event, thanks for joining us today, and we look forward to talking again with you next week when we have another great author.
You've been listening to the Avid Reader Show with your host, Sam Hankin. Sam will be back next week with reviews and interviews of some of the more interesting books and authors of today.